The Equinox gnat is named for Mount Equinox in Vermont. It is a Charles Orvis original. I'm tying it on a number 14 hook with brown thread. I have a long tag which I'm going to save to use to divide the tail. I'm referencing first the illustration in Mary Orvis Marbury's book, Favorite Flies and Their Histories, for what this fly looks like according to the illustrator. But I also have a photograph of the fly, and I noticed that the photograph clearly uses some kind of duck flank for the wing, as well as has a tail. So I am tying the fly on a number 14 hook because it is a smaller fly than the other flies at least on that page in Mary's book. I am putting a tail on it that is 2 barbs from a duck flank feather. Clip off the butt ends. And I want those barbs to divide, so I'm going to just push up on them right now like that, which divides them. And then I'll take that thread tag that I saved, put it around the bend of my hook, and bring it up between those 2 barbs. Pull the barbs down around the thread, and then just lay the thread on top of the shank and wrap over it a couple of easy wraps. And then I can pull up on that thread to separate the fibers on the tail if I want them more separated than they already are. But that will help to keep them separated as I wrap the fly. I'll go ahead and tight wrap that, and then I can clip those thread ends out. The body of this fly is quill. So when we talk about a quill body, it's the rachis, or the center of a feather, or in this case, peacock herl, the stem of the herl. And I have stripped all the fibers off that herl using a pencil eraser. There's a chemical way to do it in order to do a large batch of them, but for just a few flies it's just as easy for me to use a pencil eraser. And then I'm going to I am going to do a few more thread wraps and wrap a little bit of an underbody so that the fly body isn't so thin, particularly since I am using a fine wire hook, because that's what I have in 14 with a straight eye. I prefer to use a straight eye hook for the flies, at least the trout flies in Mary's book. Mary's hooks did not have eyes on them. So instead they had what was called gut. I'm going to just put a single whip knot in my thread so I can cradle my thread and it won't come unwound as I use the rotary function of the vise to wrap this quill. So the gut material, or what they call gut, is actually the innards of the silk caterpillar. The caterpillar was dissected, and the innards of that silk pouch were stretched and spun together to create a leader, or even just the eye that was tied onto the hook shank. Fortunately, we don't have to do that today. Our flies last longer, and we don't have to deal with that pain because we have eyes on our hooks. So I think that's about where I want to go. I'm going to grab the end of that stem with my hackle plier just so I can hold it. This gets a little bit complicated. I mean, it's not undoable, not impossible to do, but because my thread is in my cradle, the thread is pulled out quite a ways from my spool on my bobbin, and so I need to wind that back up and hold on to that stem quill while I'm doing that, getting my thread shorter where it's usable. And then I will catch that in, 3 wraps over the top. And then I can let go of it and wrap 3 under wraps. 2 or 3 is what I was taught to catch that in. Then I can go ahead and clip out the waist. And my tail is separating maybe a little bit more than I want it to, but it's fine. And you can see there is a segmentation that happens in the quill body because the quill has different shades of color on each edge. For the hackle, I'm going to use this, I think it's a furnace feather. It's got that black stripe down the middle, but it's brown on the tips, and so I will get the brown look of the hackle fibers. This is a rooster cape. Cape and neck is the same thing. It's the part of the skin that comes from around the neck of the bird. The saddle is the part that goes over the back and down towards the rump. So I'm giving it a crew cut, just pulling down on the fibers at the butt end and cutting them short. That gives my thread something to grab onto, so it's less likely then for that hackle feather to pull out. And I am tying it with the shiny side out, believing that the hackle will wrap properly and will make the fibers lean backwards towards the bend of the hook. So I'll just go ahead and wrap up on that. It kind of looks like a dry fly, what we would call a dry fly hackle now, but I'm going to force those fibers to lay back a little bit more as I wrap back on them. So I've got a number of wraps that I want, and I can catch in the tip of that hackle feather. 3 wraps over the top, then I can let go. I'll wet my fingers because I find that it's easier to grab all those fibers when I do. And as I pull back, I'm going to try to pull down. Pull back and pull down on all those fibers, not impale my thumb on the point of the hook, and then also try not to catch in hackle fibers as I wrap back and catch in that stem. Point of that actually is what it is, the point of that hackle feather. Grab that hackle feather and I can snap it out, and then I want to push down on the hackle fibers that are on top. If there's a few on top there still, that's okay. It'll kind of help that wing stand up a little bit. But I really want most of this hackle to really be more like a beard that hangs down in front of the hook point. I suspect that Mary used teal for her wings. I don't have any teal. I've tried to tie this with duck flank, mallard flank, and it just doesn't seem to cooperate properly. So I do have some gadwall. And the gadwall feathers have more black in them, and the white isn't quite as sharp as the white in Mary's feathers. But it's what I have, and it'll give me the approximate look I'm hoping. So what I did was I clipped the tip out of that feather to create this V, which I'm folding in half. and then laying that across the eye of the hook. Try to get that to stand up flat, or stand up straight, not tip over. What seems to happen for me when I tie in this kind of a feather is that those barbs will tip over sideways and lay flat on top of the hook rather than to stand up on the top of the hook. And whatever it is that Mary used, that photograph is a fly that's, well, the book was published in 1892. So what are we, 130 years later? A little over that. And that fly is still, the fibers in that wing have held up beautifully, stayed together, and whatever fibers she used did that nicely for her. For me, it just kind of becomes a jumbled mess, almost more like how we would do a dry fly wing using duck flank. So I don't know, maybe somebody out there has some advice for me on what exactly to use and how to tie that wing in better. But it's what I have, it's what I'm going with, and I've somehow laid that tail down here too. See if I can pick it up. That's the tail from the other side. Okay. Get it back where it belongs. I'll put a whip finish on it. The 8 paragraphs in Mary's book about this fly don't say anything about the fly. They just wax poetic about the setting. A little lake at the base of Mount Equinox. I've tried to identify what lake that is by looking at a map. The best I can come up with is that it's Barbos Lake. I do use a diluted goop for my head cement. I'll put a recipe for that in the description. And beg your indulgence with this attempt to tie the Equinox gnat.